Okay, so welcome. My guest today is Professor Patrick Vaughan of Jagiellonian University. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Michal. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. It's great to have you again on my channel. And this video may be unexpected for many followers because this won't be a video strictly about film, but it will be a discussion of an important political figure and definitely of a figure that you personally, you, Patrick Vaughan, made me more aware of. Back in the day when I took your Cold War history class at the Jagiellonian University as part of my PhD program, you really drove this point home for me that Jimmy Carter, as president of United States, was really one of the most important figures of 20th century American history. I never heard Carter discussed with so much knowledge and passion as I did in your class, and that was the pivotal point for me because that was the point when I really became interested in him as a character, as a man. And it so happens that this year Carter turned 100. He's 100 years old now. His birthday was the 1st of October, 2024. And when I saw this New York Times tribute, birthday tribute to him, I sent you this link saying, "Oh, here, happy birthday to President Carter." And we started to chat a little bit on the
Yeah.
messenger, and we came up with this idea of this talk. I just, this is simply a recollection. You spent a big portion of your work as an academic, as an historian, reflecting about Carter. You also wrote your book on Zbigniew Brzeziński, who was his national security advisor. So I just wanted to hear your version of who Jimmy Carter is, and who he was as an American politician in the years that he was a president. But and let me just say as a sort of opener that for me he was always quite special as this figure of great humility. This is not
hmm
a virtue that we would necessarily associate with political life nowadays. I feel like in a way he may seem like not only a man of a different era, but almost a man of a different dimension, morally speaking,
hmm
and simply on a very humane level. Was he also this sort of alien when he entered American politics in mid 70s? How he differed from the political scene at that time?
Well, I think Carter, the important thing about Carter is to understand he was a political anomaly, meaning that, um, first of all, he was a Southerner. He was raised in a very small town in Georgia um, during the Depression, and came from a working family. Now, they owned a working farm. It was a peanut farm, but they used to make fun of him about that. But when you work on a farm, you have to solve problems. That's your job is to it's not an intellectual job. And I think that's important to his upbringing is that he was a worker. He used to wake up and go to work when he was 5 or 6, 7, 9, 10 years old. And he'd actually have to sweat and work and carry peanuts and that sort of thing. And they weren't poor farmers. It was it was a big farm. The legend was that he was kind of this sort of an Abe Lincoln type figure. It was a big farm and they had money. But I think just being a worker and being a problem solver was part of his personality. So when he was getting ready to go to college, there was there's one real way out of a small town in 1940, and that was to join the military. And he ended up in Annapolis as he wanted to be a naval officer, and he was an engineer, which is another aspect of his life. If you're an engineer, you're paid to solve problems. Um, and that's unusual for an American politician. That's an unusual background. And the fact that he got into politics was kind of an accident. And I think that's part of his personality. and he wanted to be a naval officer. That was his goal in life when he went to Annapolis, head of the Naval Academy of the United States. And in the early 1950s, his father died, or something. He had to go back and run the family farm, and he found that it was in debt, and that was his job. He had to go back to his small town. That's a very American story, that somebody trying to get out of their small town that has to go back to it. It's kind of like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, that same kind of story. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
No, I was about to say that it's like from the Frank Capra movie. So go ahead,
yeah,
continue.
yeah. So he did that, and that was 1954, which was a huge landmark in American history because that was the famous Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, and civil rights era really started there in America. And it was very sensitive time if you were a Southern politician, because most of the Southern politicians in the 50s and 60s were sort of, I mean, that's not sugarcoated. They were racist, and they were sort of this good old boy type of network in the South. That's where George Wallace came from, and then Strom Thurmond and these kind of people that were in American politics until fairly recently. And Carter wanted to challenge that, I think, for moral reasons, but also practical reasons. He was a younger guy, and he saw something developing in the 1960s. It was called the New South, meaning it wasn't the old South of Tobacco Road and these kind of films about the American South. Carter saw himself, I think, as an engineer, a modernizer, a problem solver, and how to bring Georgia, which was the subject of Gone with the Wind, the Sherman's March to the Sea and all that, how to bring Georgia into the modern cultural, political, economic world of the 1960s, where everything was, it's the space age. Kennedy's in office. It's a new era of hope and opportunity. And Carter ran for local office in the early 1960s. He had some trouble with it because he was an outsider. And then he ran for governor of Georgia in 1966, and he was called Jimmy Who. Nobody knew who he was because he was just he was an outsider. But he almost won that, sort of as a articulate, progressive voice of this new generation of, he's an engineer. He went to Annapolis. He's not just from Plains, Georgia. He's got some, sort of a technical background. And then when he ran for governor of 1970, he won. And that's an important story because when he won that election in 1970, he would work in the morning from like 6 to 12, actually working on an industrial farm, agricultural farm, where he has to, he has responsibilities as the executive. And in the afternoon, he would take a car with two of his young assistants, Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell. I talked to both of them some years ago, and they both talked about this experience in that they would go to every city in Georgia. On the map, they'd pick one once a day, and they'd go and say, hey, this is Jimmy Carter. He's a new guy. He's a new voice for the South. And Carter ended up winning in 1970 as a governor of Georgia. But in those days, we only had 2 or 3 TV channels. Nobody knew who he was. In fact, how you remember, we talked about the movie Deliverance 2 or 3 years ago on your Spoiler Master channel. And Carter was actually on a game show called What's My Line in 1973, and nobody knew who he was. They had to guess who he was. It was a game show, and he finally said, I'm the governor of Georgia. That's how unknown he was in the early 1970s. Even if he was governor of a state, he was out of the political mainstream. And one of the guys that he really had to overcome if he wanted to be president of the United States was Ted Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers. And maybe we could get to that story because that's actually a great story about Carter. He was a very determined person, and he was very resentful of being condescended to because he was a Southerner from a small town. And I think that's part of Carter's determination. He was a very determined, very principled, very just he wanted to make himself better. And I think being looked down on his entire life because he was from a small town in Georgia was part of his personality. And that's why he ended up being president. And it's a really interesting story, actually. You know, Michal? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I think my mic
Yeah,
was. So
no,
he
no,
was determined, but also diligent, and he
yeah,
kept learning. This is something that I think is quite remarkable. You shared with me this audio interview with him that you did in over the phone in 2006, and
yeah,
you asked him about his relationship with Zbigniew Brzeziński, and
yeah,
Carter was very open about saying that there were huge gaps in his education, especially as far as international relations
yeah.
were concerned. But he was willing to learn, and he said that even a 1 hour conversation with Brzeziński was for him an opportunity to learn and to soak up this new knowledge. And today, as he turned 100, we know that he practically never stopped. That long after his presidency, he was still expanding his worldview and outreach, and he never was satisfied enough to just rest and call it a day. Is this diligence the part of this sort of upbringing that he received, of this sort of farmer ethos?
Yeah, Carter wrote a book. It was called Why Not the Best? And it was kind of based on his personal philosophies. You should always try to make yourself better every day. And as a farmer, as an engineer, I think he was always facing an uphill struggle, that nobody took him seriously, probably at Annapolis, because he was from Hicktown in Georgia, from a Hicktown in Georgia, small town. And when he ended up trying to run for office in Georgia, people said, "You're not from Atlanta, you're from a hick town in Georgia." And finally, in 1970, he ended up being governor of Georgia. And there's only one way to go on that because there's a 4-year term limit. So here he is, governor of Georgia in 1970, and he has to figure out what his future is. And that's the 1972 election where Richard Nixon is running against George McGovern. And the Democratic Party was during Vietnam War, and lots of things happened in the 60s and the party turned quite radical in cultural terms and political terms. And that helped Nixon win 49 states to one in 1972. McGovern didn't even win his home state of South Dakota. So Carter, I think, was part of this idea that the Democratic Party is never going to win another election unless it kind of you know, uh, it makes a priority of what they call now middle America or type of people. And Carter told me a story where at the 1972 Democratic Convention, he says, you should put me on the ticket because a Southerner might help you. And everybody kind of laughed because a Southerner on the American political ticket in 1972, especially one like Carter, he was a born again Christian. He was a very religious person. That was totally out of the zeitgeist of the early 70s, George McGovern era Democratic Party. So Carter, during the convention and after, he says, if George McGovern could get the nomination, I could get that nomination. And I'm going to run for president in 1976. And he said his whole staff sort of laughed at him. They said, you got to be joking, like you're nobody knows who you are nationally. You don't have any kind of political footprint around the world or around the country. The northern liberals aren't going to trust you because you're from the south. And Carter says, I'm going to do it, and you can join me or you can not join me, but I'm going to do it. And he made a determined effort in 1972 to run for the presidency in 1976, or at least the Democratic nomination, and he did it. And one of the great American political stories of all time is how he did it, because the big person that was in his way was Ted Kennedy. And Ted Kennedy after 1968, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and Ted Kennedy was the last of the Kennedy brothers. It's kind of a sad story. But Ted Kennedy, even after Chappaquiddick, this famous sort of incident in Massachusetts where he, that most people know the story, but he ran off the road with a young woman and she died, and it kind of, most people thought it ruined his political career. But in the 1970s, people were looking for a celebrity politician, especially after McGovern lost 49 states to one. And most thought the nomination in 76 unless somebody stopped him. And Carter says, I'm that person that's going to run against Ted Kennedy. I don't care. I'm going to run as a Southerner, as a farmer, as a sort of a new voice in American politics after Vietnam and after Watergate. And Carter won that nomination in 1976. And how he won it was really interesting. One of the ways Carter won it was just by being himself. There's a famous story of Ted Kennedy going down to Georgia to give a speech, and Hunter S. Thompson, who then was a celebrity journalist from Rolling Stone magazine, was sort of the Bible of the sort of alternative left-wing pop culture crowd, and Hunter S. Thompson said he went down there to cover Ted Kennedy's speech, but there was a governor from Georgia who gave the speech before Ted Kennedy that was much better. And Hunter S. Thompson, of course, was this crazy guy. He was always on some sort of psychedelic drugs. He wrote the famous books, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and so forth, and the campaign trail. And he wrote an article for Rolling Stone magazine in support of Carter just being sort of a normal, non-establishment guy. And you can probably find that article somewhere online. Having Hunter S. Thompson endorse Jimmy Carter sort of gave him credibility from the left wing, the kind of crazy 60s era counterculture. And he combined that with just being an engineer, a practical person who was a born-again Christian who went to Sunday school and always trying to improve himself. A good example of that, he said he used to try to read the Bible every Sunday in Spanish, right? So he was one of these people, sort of a Horatio Alger story, or like a product of the American dream, that if you want something and you work hard enough and you try it every day and you improve yourself every day, good things will come to you. And I think Carter's maybe our last example of that in American politics.
Well, the thing that was startling to me when you said it in our messenger conversation
Yeah.
was that probably he is the last American president who like held a steady, real job. Is that
Mm-hmm.
accurate?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That he was like the last real person in a way, of course, in the White
Yeah.
House.
Carter had a strategy in 1976. His mother even said, what are you doing, Jimmy, after you're governor of Georgia? And his mother was kind of she was kind of I don't know, she was in the Peace Corps. She was kind of a progressive voice, especially in the South in those days. And she was kind of a funny woman. And she says, Jimmy, what are you going to do after you're governor of Georgia? And he says, I'm running for president. She goes, oh, that's nice, Jimmy. President of what? And he says, of the United States. And his own mother kind of laughed at that. But Carter had a strategy. What he did is he knew that the Iowa caucus is really important in American politics. It's the famous, first decision of the campaign, that in New Hampshire. And Carter, after Watergate, in 1974, Gerald Ford was the president, and Nixon was still very unpopular. Nixon was sort of this terrible pariah figure in American politics. He was, the Watergate crisis was still in the air, and Carter went up to Iowa, and he basically just lived there. And he gave speeches every day, and he says, I'm just like you. I'm a farmer. I'm like you from the Midwest. I'm from the South and the Midwest, but our morals are the same. Our values are the same. And a lot of people were laughing at him. When Carter declared for president in December of 1974, the headline, you can probably find this. Maybe I can send it to you. I think I have it on my photocopy here, was the Jimmy Who. Again, like everybody knew Ted Kennedy. Everybody knew Hubert Humphrey, who was the nominee in 1968. Nobody knew Jimmy Carter. So Carter had this really big problem. And one of the people who accepted Carter, and I didn't answer your question, I apologize for that in the first couple of minutes ago, was Zbigniew Brzeziński, who was Humphrey's foreign policy advisor in 1968. And Brzezinski was, along with Henry Kissinger, sort of part of this new generation of the old establishment, meaning these are the guys on TV. Even back then, Brzezinski was on TV a lot. He was advisor for Kennedy in 1960 about what to do about Poland and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Brzezinski was still a young guy. He's younger than Carter, actually. But in the early 70s, Brzezinski started to pay attention to him, and he invited him something called the Trilateral Commission, which is really important, and it's a big can of worms that I don't really want to go into now. But it was part of a new organization that was worried about trade tariffs and a lot of things that Nixon had done in the early 1970s, and they wanted to try to globalize the world a little bit with Western Europe and Japan. Brzezinski had written a book about Japan in 1970 called The Fragile Blossom, and he thought that there was nobody really to run for president as a Democrat. He didn't like McGovern. McGovern was very dovish on foreign policy, and he was, for example, he wanted to get rid of NATO and he wanted to pull out of Vietnam completely. And McGovern was a principled person, I think. I think he's a lot like Carter in a way, but Brzezinski thought that would be a disaster because the Western alliance was important in the early 70s. And he got to know Carter in the Trilateral Commission, and I think they got along personally. And I think that's one of the big things that I think Carter told me in our conversation, is that Zbig didn't look down on him. He was the one person in Washington, D.C. that didn't look down on him and say, you're from a small town in Plains. Brzezinski talked to him like an equal. He says, hey, I like your views. You obviously are a political reality because you won a governorship of Georgia. That's one of the 50 states. So he started to form a relationship with Carter. And I think Carter appreciated that. I think there was one Washington, D.C. insider that didn't look down on him. And one of the things that Brzezinski talks about in his novel or his memoir was that he thought that Poland was like the American South, and he sent Carter a passage from William Styron's book, Sophie's Choice, talking about how Poland in the 1860s, for example, was a little bit like what the American South was going through after the Civil War. And I can probably find you that it was in the novel Sophie's Choice about, it's a really good book and film about a very disturbing topic. It's about the Holocaust and so forth. But Brzezinski understood what it's like to be an outsider, because Brzezinski was a Polish Catholic at Harvard, where most people look down on Catholics and Polish people generally, because Harvard was part of this WASP establishment. So I think he and Carter had sort of a coming together on what it's like to be an outsider, and Brzezinski appreciated Carter. And I think it's safe to say that Carter really appreciated Brzezinski because he reached out to him. And that was around 1973, 74. And finally, by 1975, they were a team. And people thought it was an unusual team, but it was a team. It was real. And I think both of them came together, and Brzezinski told Carter about how to handle the Soviet Union, how to handle Eastern Europe, how to handle Poland. And Carter listened, because Carter, as you can hear in the interview, if you listen to the interview I sent you, Carter said he didn't know anything about Eastern Europe. I'm a peanut farmer from Georgia. I don't know what's going on over there. And Zbig, he called him Zbig, helped me out on that. And one of the big things he did is to say that there's the Helsinki Final Act was something that was really important, and the Ford administration was not paying attention to it, and especially Henry Kissinger was not paying attention to it. Was that the basket three aspect paid attention to things like human rights. And at that time, Poland was under the a political and military occupation by the Soviet Union in 1975. And Brzezinski kept telling Carter, we can, the Iron Curtain is not a metaphor that is precise. It's more of a semi-permeable membrane. And there are people behind the Iron Curtain in Poland they are not communists. They are what he called them. They're like onions. He says they're red on the outside and white on the inside. And there's an inroads we can make there. And Carter started talking about human rights when nobody even knew what he was talking about. And that was the famous debate where Ford said Poland was not under the Soviet domination. And a lot of that came from the conversation Carter had with Brzezinski the day before in San Francisco. And I think you could probably hear it on the interview I gave him. He said, "Man, I was nervous as hell, man. I was going, I was going to debate the president of the United States, and I'm a peanut farmer from Georgia, but Brzezinski gave me some really good advice." And that was what prompted Ford to make that famous gaffe where Poland is not dominated by the Soviet Union. And a lot of people say that's why Carter beat Ford in the election by a very narrow margin, but he beat him. Um, and people think it was because of Poland. That issue made Ford look sort of oblivious to one of the common sense geopolitical factors that everybody sitting at home knew, right? That the Soviet Union had dominated Eastern Europe after 1945. And Carter, who was a political novice, at least he could say, you know, I'm not president, but at least I know that fact. And Brzezinski was really important in that. Brzezinski kept Carter disciplined, and he kept him in the centrist path. And I think that was really important because the Democratic Party in the 70s was completely, you know, it was a crazy time in the 70s. And I even, the story of Carter getting the nomination, going to New York City, just to bring it back to your expertise, that was the same year that Taxi Driver came out. And in New York City, Carter from Georgia, from a small town in Georgia, going up to Taxi Driver Scorsese, New York City to get the nomination in 1976 was sort of one of those great American stories where you couldn't really make this up. And Carter did a good job. And Carter fought the establishment. Ted Kennedy thought about getting in, and Hubert Humphrey, and Carter says, "Get in. I've paid the dues. I've campaigned, and I'm going to beat you. If you get in, I'm going to beat you." And Carter famously said, "If Ted Kennedy wants to get in, I'm going to beat him. And if he doesn't like it, he can kiss my ass." And people said, "Whoa, that's like a born Christian who's talking like that." But that was the dichotomy of Carter. He was also a fighter. He was a born again Christian. He was a very peaceful sort of guy, but he was determined. And he didn't like when Kennedy said he was getting in late in the campaign in 76 after Carter had almost won all the delegates needed. Kennedy says, "Well, I think I'm going to get in now." And Carter says, "That's not fair. That's not right." And I think that was the first time where Carter felt that Kennedy and the political establishment didn't like him and didn't trust him and didn't respect him. And Carter dug in. And I think that's why Carter won in 76. People respect a fighter, and even one who's from a small town in Georgia. People respect somebody who stands up for themselves. And
Well, that's
yeah,
appropriate then that the 1976 Best Picture Oscar winner is Rocky, because in,
yeah,
in
that's
a way,
true.
in a way, Jimmy Carter is exactly like, Rocky, even though Rocky loses at the end technically, but he puts up the best fight that he can, right?
That
Yeah.
I think that's a very good metaphor because Rocky came out in 76 after Vietnam and everything was Americans can't do anything right. And it's been, 10 years of chaos and war and inflation and, Watergate and everything. And Rocky was about a guy who came from nothing and, you know, he tried to work hard. He woke up in the morning and ate raw eggs and went running and went 15 rounds with Apollo Creed. And that's kind of Carter. I never really thought about that before, but that's a good point. Carter was like that. Carter was like that against Ted Kennedy and Gerald Ford, who was the president, and Carter won. And that's why Carter was such a unusual character in American history. He won when people didn't think he could win. And
Right.
so, but his presidency was another story. It was
Yeah, well,
he.
let's talk
You know,
about his presidency a little bit because I think I only recently started to fully appreciate just how difficult a time was. I mean, that was probably, in terms of timing, that was probably one of the most difficult presidencies because uh, Cold War was still going on, but it was profoundly changing at that time.
yeah,
After the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, but also after
yeah.
Cambodia and Pol Pot and all
Mhm.
those things, we know now with the benefit of the hindsight that this is exactly when Cold War sort of shifted, right? And
Yeah.
Iran is part of that. Suddenly those more religious forces in the Islamic countries became much more important, and in many ways this was almost like a new chapter in Cold War history. But as it was happening, they didn't have the benefit of a hindsight. They had the benefit of, let's say, Brzezinski's intuition in this case.
Yeah.
So what was as you see it now, and especially after many years, what was the biggest challenge of that presidency? Of course, mostly in terms of international relations, and that's a big question.
Well,
You can pick
yeah, it's a big
whatever.
question, but I will try to keep it simple and non-geopolitical. One thing about Carter, when he won, he named Brzezinski as his national security advisor, which was, in a fancy term, it's like saying his personal advisor on global affairs, right? And that's different than the Secretary of State, who was more of a bureaucrat and more formal and going to banquets and things like this. But Brzezinski was a geopolitical expert who Carter trusted. That's important. And I've actually had many conversations with Brzezinski. I mean, more than I can count. And we always talked about that transition from December of 76 to January of 77. There are a lot of things happened there. One was there was an underground movement in Poland happening around that time that basically very few people in the West were paying attention to. And there was one in Czechoslovakia called Charter 77. Havel was in charge of that. It happened in the first week of 1977. So in the months between Carter getting elected in November of 76 and the time he took office in January of 1977, the East Central Europe situation was starting to change a little bit. And I think if anybody else was advising Carter, they would just, well, that's something far away. We don't know much about that. But Brzezinski was all over this. And he starts talking about human rights and how to use this as a weapon against the Soviet Empire. And Brzezinski was a very young man when he wrote his MA thesis. Most people are writing some, sort of esoteric topic that's sort of academic. He wrote a topic about the Soviet Union being an artificial empire. He's 21, 22 years old at McGill University. And he's writing a thesis about how the Soviet Union there's no real Soviet Union. It's a fake empire based, on a centralized empire in Moscow, but it has mostly people who are not Russian, or at least 50-50 that are not Russian. And that's artificial. And that's the weak point of the Soviet Union. He called it its Achilles heel. So when Carter comes in 1977 and he's giving his inaugural address on January 20th, 1977, Brzezinski inserts something. It's only a 14-minute speech, but 2 minutes of that speech is about how human rights is important and the Soviet Union is not respecting the Helsinki Final Act Basket 3 that was signed in Helsinki in 1975. It's a little bit, I'm getting into the weeds of geopolitics there and history, but basically there was a weak point in the Soviet Union, and Brzezinski was pushing for it from day one. That was Carter's inaugural address. And most people in Newsweek and Time and the New York Times said Carter's inaugural address was only 14 minutes. It was really cold and it was kind of boring. And it wasn't like John Kennedy's speech. It was really, it was too short. And Carter's a technocrat, and people were making fun because he had a suit bought off the rack, meaning it was like from Sears or J.C. Penney. And Carter was kind of, they were kind of condescending to him. But Brzezinski's put 2 minutes into that speech about Helsinki and human rights, and There you go.
This is
There's
the
the
cover, I think, that you mentioned, right?
there we go. Yeah. And but the one person listening to that speech, and this is the power of technology, and Brzezinski was big on technology. He wrote a book called Between Two Ages about how technology is the revolution of technology is much more important than the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or even the French Revolution. He said the technology revolution of the 60s and 70s is really important. And as a physical example of that, or a practical example of that, when Carter gave that 14-minute inaugural address on a cold day in DC in January 1977, it wasn't just the American people who heard it. Andrei Sakharov heard it, who was a famous dissident in the Soviet Union. He was the famous architect of the Soviet nuclear program. And Sakharov heard that and he said, this is a new age. This is the first time I've ever seen or heard an American president talk about things like human rights in the Soviet Union. And that's going to be really important. And if Sakharov starts hearing that, other dissidents in Poland will hear that because they were looking at Sakharov as a model for their dissident objections to being what they saw as an oppressive communist system. And the media in America after that started really taking an unusual angle on this. They started saying Carter was naive, talking about how he can change the system in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It was, you know, he was causing trouble. And Brzezinski got a lot of heat in the American media for that. And Brzezinski says, listen, those people in Poland don't want to live under that system. And we can't just keep ignoring that fact. And Carter said something very simple, was human rights is a, you know, it's a fact of life. Carter was a big admirer of Martin Luther King in the 60s and the civil rights movement in the South. So we should be respectful of those people and we should, you know, respect their rights and their ambitions to be free and, you know, as a free nation state, not a part of the Soviet Empire. And everybody was making fun of Carter in the early days of that he was naive. He was kind of, you know, he didn't know what was going on. But behind the scenes, Brzezinski was tough. He was really tough on this. And he told Carter, you got to stay with this. And the whole State Department bureaucracy was telling Brzezinski to back off. We don't want to cause problems with the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski says, listen, my father was a Polish diplomat. He was in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s. He knows how the Soviet mind works, and they respect strength and they take advantage of weakness. And if you show any weakness on this, we're going to lose this. And Carter, I think, to his great, you know, candor, said, I don't know anything about this system. I trust you on this. And he trusted Zbig on this. And that was a big deal in 77 and 78, things like human rights. And people like Nicknick, who was still around, you know, I talked to him a little bit about this. He says that gave the Polish dissident movement a lot of confidence that the American president and Brzezinski, by extension, as his key foreign policy advisor, actually cared about us. Because when Nixon came to Poland in the 1972, he didn't say anything. He just talked about trade agreements and things like this. But Carter, even if he was a sort of a peanut farmer from Georgia, started talking about this and people listened. And that was important. And, you know, that's not a thing that made headlines. You know, it wasn't dramatic like Vietnam War, or, you know, Iran later on, but it was slow underground revolution that was pushed on Radio Free Europe. I talked to Jan Novak Jagiellonian about this a lot. He said that Brzezinski was really important in getting these things on the radio, Volna Europa, where it was still illegal, technical to listen to it, but people did. And that message about just dignity and human rights really got through the Berlin Wall at a time when most people thought that was never going to change. And Carter, through Brzezinski, I think, said, it's only going to change if we push it and make it change. And I don't think any of Carter's the contemporary journalistic analysis of Carter, nobody paid attention to this. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book that I did was to bring this to attention. And I think Zbig appreciated that. And that's how we ended up being, you know, we had a good 20, 25-year relationship until he died a couple of years ago, because I think I mentioned this, and especially one of the big things, and I was just at a conference last week at the Canadian embassy talking about Ukraine. And I said, one of the things that Brzezinski really did was to prevent a Soviet invasion of Ukraine or Poland in December of 1980. And I'll be happy to talk about that if you want. But that didn't make any headlines. But when Solidarity happened in the summer of 1980, most people in the West were thinking that the Soviets were going to go in and crush it, just like they did Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 68. But Brzezinski was still in office then, and he knew that issue very well. He knew the opposition very well, but he also knew, he had kind of a relationship with the Polish communist government just through formal diplomatic terms. And he also knew the Polish ambassador in America at that time. And Brzezinski said, this is a real turning point. And if we mishandle this, this is going to be terrible. And what he really told Carter is we have to have this solidarity movement survive. We can't have it crushed. And when the State Department was telling Carter, lay off this issue, this is the Soviet sphere of influence, we don't want to cause trouble, Brzezinski was telling Carter, you gotta fight back, and you got to tell the Soviets if they invade Poland, there's going to be a penalty. And Brzezinski did that. And I wrote an article about this. It's in the Polish Review. You can probably Google it now and find it. But I said that Brzezinski knew the Soviet Union and he knew Poland, and he had the president's ear. And Carter trusted him. And Carter had lost an election to Reagan by a lot. But Brzezinski took tangible efforts, often behind the scenes, stuff that didn't make the papers, to tell the Soviets, if you go into Poland, there's going to be a cost of this, and you're going to pay for it. And that's the article I wrote. And I think that's a big part of Carter's legacy, is he was really tough on the Soviet Union, not soft. And somebody who they proofread my book on Brzezinski said that the square in Krakow where I'm talking to you from should not be the Ronald Reagan Square. It should be sort of the Zbigniew Brzeziński Square, because he's the one who sort of knew the Soviet Union, and he knew how to talk to American politicians to be tough and go after the weak points of the Soviet Empire, and he did. And that's a really important story that I don't think has been told enough.
That's one of the chapters of Carter Brzezinski's administration's many I mean it's a huge subject. Of course, we won't touch
Yeah.
upon everything
Yeah,
today.
it's really complicated. Yeah.
But I also wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that Carter was an engineer, that he was very solution oriented. Let's say he liked things that worked. Did he find the Washington bureaucracy, the whole apparatus of power, efficient or not? Was there any tension there between his mindset and the machine, the political machine of Washington D.C.?
Well, Carter didn't like politicians, really. Carter, as I said before, was an engineer, and engineers are paid to solve problems, and most Washington politicians are lawyers who are paid to make problems, right? Or they're paid to make problems extend beyond their natural life so they can make more money. I think that's fair to say. It's a kind of an unfair professional joke, but I think Carter thought he could solve problems, and he thought he could solve things like inflation by being practical, labor problems, racial problems. Carter famously put a portrait of Martin Luther King in the Atlanta state office in 1971, and he was really progressive on things like civil rights at a time when most Southerners weren't. I think that's fair to say. But Brzezinski was also a problem solver. And I think one of the things that Brzezinski told Carter is you got to cut through the bureaucracy if you want to get anything done. Like, we send a memo to the State Department, you're going to get 10 reasons why we can't do this. And Brzezinski was telling Carter in the morning, he met with Carter in the morning every day, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. And he told Carter, we got to do these 5 or 6 things like normalizing relations with China, which were really, if you get that into the State Department bureaucracy, it's going to take forever. And Brzezinski says, let me take care of it. I can do it in 8 weeks, right? Let me try. And Brzezinski went to China. He met with Deng Xiaoping. And within 6 months, they had a relationship with China, which was, at the time, China was like an associate member of NATO in 1979, 1980, and Brzezinski did that almost personally. In fact, when Deng Xiaoping came to America in 1979, he went to Brzezinski's house personally, and they toasted over Brezhnev's favorite vodka, meaning that Brzezinski was anti-Soviet and the Chinese were anti-Soviet. And that was really important in separating China and the Soviet Union. Brzezinski had spent most of his academic life saying how important that was. And, you know, Brzezinski was really he was a cold warrior, but he was a pragmatic, very smart. You know, you have to be tough when you need to be tough, but you have to be smart when you need to be smart. And I think Carter, as an engineer, respected that. And as Carter went through office, he realized most bureaucrats in the State Department are bureaucrats. They're not going to get anything done. Brzezinski was a fighter like him. And I think they really had that in common. I think one of the important things to realize is in 1977, when Carter came to office, there was a kind of a famous analysis from NATO that said, you know, if the Soviet Union really wanted to invade Western Europe, it could do it in probably 48 hours. Just because the geopolitical leverage of having a Eurasian, you know, huge red army on the eastern, you know, part of Europe. And I think Brzezinski told Carter, you know, we don't want to fight this war, but we can fight a tactical war, like a chess match. And the way to do it, and this is important, Brzezinski was telling Carter about Ukrainian nationalism in 1978 and how Ukrainians don't really feel like they're part of the Soviet Union. And the reason Brzezinski knew this is because his father was in the Battle of Lviv, you know, so most American politicians or even, you know, advisors had no idea what that was. And Brzezinski had a very, you know, his father told him about Ukraine and these kind of things. And in the 70s, most people thought the Soviet Union was just this giant empire. And Brzezinski was one of the few people. In fact, Richard Pipes told me a story where in the 1960s, Brzezinski, as an academic from Columbia, came in to advise the Johnson administration on the Soviet Union. And he had this map, and he said that most of the Soviet Union is not Russian. It's a conquered nationalities that are resentful of Russian nationalism. And he said everybody in the State Department sort of laughed at him, you know, because they were diplomats and they were academics, and they kind of laughed at this. And Brzezinski says, well, you can laugh if you want, but this is the reality. And the way that you defeat the Soviet Union is not by fighting a war, because they would love to fight a war. That's one thing they're good at. The way to defeat the Soviet Union is through an intellectual combat and trying to implode the weak spots of the empire, first in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, those kind of places, then maybe in the Baltic states and Ukraine. And this was kind of crazy talk in the 70s with Brzezinski. I've seen the memos he's sending them in the 70s. And of course, that doesn't make the newspapers because he doesn't want to make the newspapers, but it was important. And I think that's why Solidarity happened in 1980. And that's why what everybody says the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. There was a lot of things that happened before the Berlin Wall fell. And one of them was Solidarity. In fact, I had a conversation with Jaruzelski. I don't know, must be 20 years ago now. He was sort of old and frail, but he still had his wits about him. And it was supposed to be a 20, 30-minute interview set up by my agent or something. Or actually, Brzezinski set it up, I think. And that ended up being a 3-hour conversation. And Jaruzelski told me that the Soviets didn't know Carter. They thought he was kind of weird, but they knew Brzezinski and they were afraid of him. Because Brzezinski knew the weak spots of the Soviet Empire, and the Soviets knew that he knew the weak spots. And that's a very different thing than just being like Reagan and calling it the evil empire. Brzezinski knew the weak spots, and he was willing to fight, and he was willing to engage Carter in that battle, even if Carter didn't know it. Because as Carter said, he was just you know, he's a peanut farmer. And Zbig gave him a backbone to keep fighting on this. And I think that's how Solidarity emerged in August of 1980 through Carter's visit to, one of the big things was Carter visited Poland in 1977 on New Year's Eve, or right around there. And I think he wanted to talk about that when Brzezinski told Carter to go to Poland in 1977, and Carter did that as part of his first foreign policy trip.
Yeah, that was late December of 1977, and he
Yeah,
met with
yeah,
Edvard Gierek, but really the sort of the main audience of this visit were the members of the opposition, right?
yeah.
They were sort of the ones that he really wanted to uh, send a signal to. Uh, there are a million topics. There's Iran, there's Middle East. There's so many things that we could talk about. But I wonder what was the end of the presidency like, and his going back to Plains, Georgia, and I mean, there was this huge crisis in Iran at that time, of course, and there was this sense of defeat for the presidency, at least
Yeah.
on the outside. But do you know how those last days and months of the presidency and also the first months post presidency were like for Carter?
Yeah, Carter had a terrible, Carter came into office, and let's face it, he came into office because he wasn't Richard Nixon. He had this famous phrase, I'll always tell you the truth. And most people said, man, I don't know who this guy is, but at least he's not Richard Nixon. And Carter had this sort of what they call a brief honeymoon, like 1977, 78, things were okay. People were, whatever. People were more into Saturday Night Fever and disco and that sort of thing. We've talked even about those films in the late 70s. But Carter had a terrible year in 1979, just a disaster. The hostages were taken in the Iranian embassy. There were television shows dedicated completely to that. America held hostage. Walter Cronkite was saying, welcome to the CBS Evening News, day number 23 of America held hostage. And Carter, he looked weak and he looked like he wasn't doing anything. And this is after Vietnam, and America was called sort of the helpless, pitiful giant, and it couldn't do anything right. And Carter also had some unfortunate personal things. He went on a 5K run back then. If you've seen Forrest Gump, jogging was sort of fashionable, and Carter went on a run, and he, in front of you know, a lot of TV cameras, he fell down and he looked like he was dead. It looked really terrible. The American president falls down in a charity, 5K. There was a famous case where he was afraid of a rabbit. I probably mentioned that in your class, where Carter went on vacation back to Georgia, and he was seen in a boat fishing, and he looked like he was having a panic attack, and they asked him what he was afraid of, and he said, well, it was a rabbit. And Carter, once it gets into the late night comedians, Carter had a terrible year in 79. In 1980, the hostages were taken. They were still taken when Reagan got into the race, and Ted Kennedy got into the race from his own party. So I think Carter felt betrayed by the establishment. And when he lost in 1980 to Reagan, it wasn't even close. And Reagan beat him. Reagan took a lot of the South, which most people thought Carter was Georgia. He would keep the South. Reagan took a lot of the mountain states, and it wasn't even close. And I think one of the things that says a lot about Carter is he kept trying to get the hostages out when he was in tradition. He was still the president, but it's kind of like we have the situation now. If we're talking now in November of 24, where there's a sitting president and an incoming president. And Carter did a lot. And one of the things that you mentioned in your email to me about Carter's humility is that Carter was still trying to get the hostages out on January 20th, 1981. And Reagan was coming into office, and Carter had to be there, obviously, for the transition of power. But Carter got into his plane, and Brzeziński told me the story. They went down to Plains, Georgia. This is the guy that was president a half hour earlier, but he was no longer president. And Carter went to Plains, Georgia. And you can imagine that this would never happen today. Carter went back to his hometown of 600 people, and there was, 700 people maybe at this party, and they all brought covered dishes, things like potato salad and macaroni and cheese, and cornbread and grits and things like this. And they just had a party in Plains, and Carter was happy to be there. He looked relieved, like he'd coming home. He was coming home. The media was there, but mostly the media was paying attention to Reagan coming in, and Reagan had Frank Sinatra there at his inauguration, and all the old Hollywood celebrities. And it was very glamour. Reagan had tails and a top hat, I think, or at least he had tails. It was like a very formal event. And Carter was in jeans, and the Carter's cabinet gave him a present, a going away present, and it was a woodworking kit from Sears. It cost $100, and that was the going away present they gave to Carter. And Carter was a real carpenter. He was a real woodworker. And he was not only a farmer, but he liked to work with his hands. And they gave him that, and that I thought was emblematic of Carter's personality. He said, "Thanks. I can't think of a better president or present, to give to a former president, because that's all I want to do now. I want to go back to Georgia and work." And that was the start of the Habitat for Humanity, where Carter spent his ex-presidency building homes for people who couldn't afford homes.
I
And
wanted to actually ask you about that because in that
yeah,
2006 conversation with him, you
yeah,
mentioned that you were part of this Habitat for Humanity in West Virginia, right? So
yeah.
how was that? What were you doing there? What was the organization like?
Well, for Humanity, in case your listeners don't know, is a Carter set up this program where people who couldn't afford homes, Carter would go with his team and they would build a home and kind of take care of the infrastructure and the loans and things. And in 2006, I was in West Virginia. I was teaching classes there, and somebody called me up and said, "Hey, we know my brother's a house builder, and I worked in the summers with my brother for years. My brother's a great carpenter and a great house builder. And in fact, he once told me that he saw Carter on a video building houses. And he said, Carter's also, it's not a fake thing. Carter's really good with power tools and building homes and things like that." So the head of the Habitat for Humanity in West Virginia called me up and said if I would like to help on Saturdays and Sundays. And I said, sure, of course, I'd be happy to. And it ended up, we didn't do it every weekend, but probably, I don't know, once a month or so, I would go and help build somebody's house, and it was mostly just cutting wood, cutting 2x4s or cleaning up around the job site. Or, we weren't specialists. We had plumbers and electricians, but we would do the easy stuff. And it was fun for me. And the people who bought the house actually came and thanked us for doing the work. And I said, thank Jimmy Carter, because he could have been just like an ordinary president and went and made $30,000 an hour and given speeches or something, but he did something practical. And Carter, that was part of his background. He came from a small town and he went back to a small town. And most people that go to DC stay in DC. Clinton and Obama, Bush, those kind of people, they end up going to president, for 4 years, and then they leave and they stay in DC. And Carter said, I'm done with DC. And I don't think he ever went back. And Carter, Carter's kind of funny because, one of the Allman brothers died, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and he went to the funeral, and people are, the Allman brothers are this famous sort of Southern rock band. And Bob Dylan liked Carter, Hunter S. Thompson liked Carter. Um, I think Carter's getting a lot of appreciation now that he's proven to be not a regular politician, and people are starting to appreciate that more because we've seen so many sort of plastic celebrity politicians come and go. And Carter's still with us. He's 100 years old, and he's a fighter. And he also was married for 60 years, which I think is also important. Carter was married to the same woman, Rosalind, and she helped him on the farm. She did the books and he did the work in the 50s. Not a lot of American politicians like that anymore. And that's another day. And just personally speaking, I really miss that generation.
Mm. Yeah, he was also, I think, a favorite president of Jonathan Demme, the film director who was famous for Something Wild and then for Silence of the Lambs. But you know, he actually directed a documentary on Carter, which is called Jimmy Carter, Men from Plains. That
I
was, I
didn't
think,
know that. Yeah,
that was around
yeah.
2008, I guess, which also
No,
showcased him as a humanitarian and, you know, someone who kept on, you know, also teaching, but, you know, vocally supporting human rights, really. I mean, until
yeah,
that was his, that remained his main
yeah,
issue. That was also,
yeah.
you know, in terms of the situation in the Middle East and stuff. I have to say that you know, this kind of humanity that he represents is sorely missed, and I don't mean only American politics. I think most generally in politics, you know, this sort of sense of lived-in experience, but also of this humility, as you mentioned, but you know, this resilience, but coming from a real place. You know, I think this is something nowadays you could probably just, you know, hire AI to generate the next president, you know,
Yeah,
because they seem less and less
yeah,
real, and more
yeah.
like, you know, those media products.
I can give you an example of Carter's difficulty being a politician and juxtapose that with the difficulties of being dealing with everybody else. In 1977, Brzezinski came into office and he says, we got to solve this problem in the Middle East. And the only way we're going to do it is get everybody together. And Brzezinski sent him memos, and Brzezinski was talking about this in the campaign trail. And he was saying Israel, you know, in the 68 campaign, Brzezinski told Humphrey that it's really dangerous not to settle this 67 war problem, the aftermath of the 6 Day War. And that's, 67. And it was still, it was still very hostile negotiating atmosphere. And Brzezinski says, we can solve this now or never. So we got to do it. So that didn't get done. And so when he was advising Carter in 76, he said to Carter, this Middle Eastern problem is never going to get fixed until you knock heads together. You got to get everybody together. And Brzezinski had this idea to get everybody together in Geneva, the Arabs, the Israelis, even the Soviets. And Brzezinski was a famous, he didn't like the Soviets, but he says, we got to bring them in just to make sure there's a comprehensive peace. And he even included the PLO in that. And then that was it was really politically dangerous for Carter at that time. And the Israelis said, we're not going unless the PLO's going. And Carter kind of gave into that. His domestic advisors told him, don't do that. And you don't want to alienate, the Israelis because there's domestic politics involved in that. And Brzezinski says, man, there's domestic politics, but you're in your first year in office. Now's the time to take a risk. And Carter backed off on that. There was no Geneva conference. And the next week, Sadat, and we're probably getting into some geopolitical history that's going to lose some of your listeners or your viewers, but Sadat went to Israel and they ended up going to Camp David for 2 weeks, where Carter basically got Sadat and Begin together, the Israeli leader, and said, we're not leaving until you get an agreement here. And they spent 2 or 3 weeks up at Camp David in the presidential retreat, and they ended up getting an agreement. But I think that was the last time an American president really tried hard to solve that problem, like really tried and said, blood and guts negotiations. You're not going to get everything you want. You're not going to get everything you want. And Carter should have won a Nobel Peace Prize for that. And I think Brzezinski, behind the scenes, nobody was ever going to get give Brzezinski a prize in the 1970s. He was really had a hard time with the media and journalists and things like this. But Carter at least should have got that, because they did give it to Sadat and Begin, but Carter didn't get a Nobel Peace Prize until many years later. And a lot of people thought it was a retroactive prize for trying to solve that problem. And now, as we speak today,
Mm.
in 2024, that whole region's a mess. And I think Brzezinski was telling Carter, unless you solve this problem's never going to get solved. And Brzezinski took a lot of heat from that. A lot of people called him a lot of names, especially because of his Polish background. And Brzezinski says, "I'm just trying to help you help yourselves." And I think Brzezinski was also saying that to the Soviet Union. He was telling the Soviet leaders, you can try to keep your empire that goes from East Berlin to Vladivostok, but you can't sit on a throne of bayonets. You can't keep people confined if they don't want to be confined. And if you try to do that forever, it's not only going to be bad for us, it's going to be bad for you. And I think Brzezinski was a very pragmatic person in that way. And I think Carter, because he was an engineer, listened to him on that. And things like the Middle East and the Soviet Union, I don't think Carter got enough credit for seeing a problem and trying to solve it. So if Demi liked him, I still haven't seen that movie, but Carter was a pretty humble guy, and I think Carter, there's a difference between being humble and being a pushover. Carter was a humble guy, but he was also tough. Carter didn't like getting pushed around, and sometimes Carter went, he would try to tell people he listens to Mozart every morning in the White House, and I think that was kind of Carter's over sensitivity about being seen as being a Southern guy from Georgia. And he was, he said, I'm cultured too, we people, and I think Carter always felt that he never had any support. Carter never had nobody ever had his back when he was president. His staff did maybe, but Brzezinski told me a story where Carter got challenged by Ted Kennedy in 1979 and 1980 in the primaries. And Brzezinski said half the State Department that was supposed to be, working for Carter secretly was, working for Kennedy, or at least hoping Kennedy would beat him. So Carter always felt that he got stabbed in the back, I think, by the DC establishment, not only in the Republican Party, which was naturally his enemy because Reagan was running against him, but also his own party. And I think that's going to be ignored in a couple, whenever Carter dies in the next year. So, well, who knows? Maybe Carter's got more in him than we think. But when Carter eventually does die, I think the media is going to call him a saint and all of this sort of thing. But I think Carter was a fighter, and Carter never forgave some people that were supposed to be his allies for not sticking up for him in DC. And I think that's one reason he never went back.
Right, right. Well, I will only say that it's unlikely that we will get a biopic of Carter, although I would like to see that because, there
Yeah.
are films about Nixon, there's even a film about Reagan that was released quite recently.
Yeah.
But it seems that Carter's presidency is just too complex and too maybe inconspicuous, in a
Yeah.
way to dramatize in those huge terms. Nixon has
Yeah.
Watergate. Reagan has the evil empire, and and here is here is this actual politician, who
Mm.
does politics, by incremental small moves, and I would love to see a good film about him, but I somehow don't imagine that it will ever be made. But I hope that people who listen to you talking about him will uh, research
Well,
more, and will stay interested in this man, because he's quite a figure, I would say.
Carter took a lot of risks, and he didn't get credit for them. Like the whole gamble trying to solve the Middle East problem was a gamble, especially from a Southern Baptist, born again Christian. Like he had, it's like a strange kind of political background to try to get into the Middle East problem. He tried to deal with the Soviet Union in a very uh, confrontational way because the Soviets were not afraid of people who were rhetorically tough in the Soviet Union, but when they were talking about things like human rights, they knew that was sensitive to their empire, is the keeping the dissidents quiet, and even put them in psychological wards and things like this. It was a very difficult time if you read Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov to be a dissident in the Soviet Union, and Carter gave them hope. And sometimes if you're a fighter, all you need is hope. But if you don't see any hope in the West, one of the things that Brzezinski told me is that the West Germans were always trying to get him to get rid of Radio Free Europe and Volna Europa. And Brzezinski said it's not just a radio station, a physical radio station. It was housed in Munich and in West Germany at the time. But Radio Free Europe gives people hope. And sometimes if you're a revolutionary or you're kind of sitting on the fence whether to try to challenge the system, the most important thing you need is hope.
Right.
And I think that was evident in the civil rights movement in the 60s and in the South under Carter, and also the dissident movements, people like Meeknick and, some of the people in Havel, these people that later became sort of famous as, but they started out as dissidents, and Brzezinski, by talking about them to Carter and through Carter, they had hope. And I think when Carter came to Poland in 1977, nobody thought there would ever be a solidarity movement, in 2 or 3 years later. And
Right.
there's another thing that I wrote an article about where Brzezinski had a pretty good relationship with Jan Pavel II and John Paul II, which was pretty much undercover. And I couldn't, a lot of that was sort of, they were both Polish, they were both the same generation, and both of them knew that the Soviet Union had a significant weak spots. And I also wrote an article about that was in a book by Charles Gotti that you can get. I think it's translated into Polish, and you can probably find it. It's called Zbig. But Brzezinski had a pretty good relationship with the Polish Pope. And when John Paul II came to America in 1979, one of the few people he met, on a personal basis was Brzezinski. And they talked, and, there's a lot going on at the time. There's the Iran crisis and things like this. But two Polish guys born about the same time in the 1920s, both went through World War II, sort of that terrible experience that Poland, you know, everybody that knows anything about Polish history knows how difficult that time was. And both of them came into power in the late 1970s sort of unexpectedly. And one of the problems I had about the article is the editor had a theory that the Brzezinski elected John Paul II, like behind the scenes in the Vatican sort of bureaucracy and the machinations. And I asked Jaruzelski about that, and he said the Soviets definitely thought that. Like Andropov at the KGB said, for sure, this is what happened. So, that could never make the headlines in the newspapers in 1978 in October when it happened. But I think there's a chance that it did, or at least he had something to do with it, and he knew that a Polish Pope coming into power in 1978 when the Soviet Union was also dealing with all sorts of other problems. When the Pope came to Poland in 1979 in the June, late, spring, early summer of 1979, that was a seismic change in the Cold War. That changed everything. And I think Brzezinski knew that more than most American bureaucrats, and even more than Carter did. I don't think Carter knew the power of that visit, what was going to happen. But I think if any of your Polish listeners can talk to their parents or their grandparents now, I guess, and go back to that time in 1979 when he did come, that's important. There's actually a conversation where Brezhnev is talking to Gierek about that, and he says, "Don't let that guy, don't let him come to Poland." And Gierek says, "I can't do anything about it. He's the Pope, and he wants to come back to Poland." And Brzezinski, is watching in 1979, and he says, "That's just another way to expose the weakness of the Soviet Empire to get to the moral weakness of it." And the Pope isn't as popular as he was some years ago, but I think he was a really important historical figure with Brzezinski in exposing the weaknesses of the Soviet Union. And you couldn't put these things into a movie unless they were kind of exaggerated, or like a lot of stuff happens in geopolitics that you can't make a movie out of it. It's just
Right.
it's.
Well,
So
uh,
anyway,
I'm happy that that we talked. I hope that this video reaches many people who sort of maybe were in this interested in Carter or dismissed him as this sort of bland president or whatever. But I remember from your class, and this is exactly what I feel right now, that you really make a great case for him as as one of the pivotal figures of 20th century America and the world. So thank you
mhm.
for sharing that, and hopefully
Yeah.
we can
And
continue
maybe
this.
I can end here because one of your questions was about Carter's humility, and I didn't really answer,
Right,
I don't
right.
think.
The
But
humility,
one of the
yeah.
things he came into office in January of 1977, and he would wear jeans and he wore a sweater on television. He got rid of "Hail to the Chief" when the president walked in the room, and he was very like he actually says, "I'm going to carry my own luggage," and he was really. Maybe that was some politics that saying I'm not Richard Nixon or I'm not the imperial presidency, but I think that he really wanted to show that the president should just be a regular person. And I think Carter, he's considered a failure because he was only a one-term president, but I think his legacy, I think we missed that. And I think we really need his kind of presidency now. Somebody asked me, and I get asked over the last 20 years, probably once a day, about the American presidency. And I said, what we really need now is a boring president personally, but solves problems privately, as an engineer might do it. And I think now we have just the opposite, the last 20 years or so. And I think Carter looks at foreign policy and he tried to solve a lot of problems quietly. Whereas in the last couple of years, I think we've had politicians who look at a problem and they make it worse, right? And that's the opposite of what an engineer would do. And I think Carter's legacy was that he tried to solve problems quietly. He didn't take a lot of credit for things he did. But I think we miss him, and I think we miss his generation of Americans that were born on a farm or worked on a farm, went to naval school, became an engineer, went back to a farm. That's kind of the Abraham Lincoln story in modern terms. And Carter, I think he's the last of his generation, and we miss him. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about it. Carter's a difficult topic to talk about because, as you said, a lot of his presidency was nuance and kind of symbolism, but he did a lot for America, and I think he did a lot uh, just to show that a common, kind of decent, regular guy could end up being president, and I think we owe him for that.
That's a perfect note to end this. So let's hope for this for the future as well. Uh,
You know.
Thank you, and hopefully see you next time. This is becoming like a series of talks between us.
Well, I don't know. This has gone a little bit long. Maybe you got to edit some of it, but thanks for the time. It's really good to talk to you
Thank
as
you.
usual, Michal, and we'll see you next time.